3 o'clock in the morning. A secure satellite phone. 4 letters flashing on the screen. Kremlin. In that silent hour before dawn, the future of Africa and the balance of global power shifted. The caller was not a diplomat, not a minister, but Vladimir Putin himself. And the one answering was not a Western general, not a Russian ally, but a 35-year-old soldier from Burkina Faso, whose very name has become a rallying cry. Ibrahim Traoré. Why would the man who outplayed NATO, who turned pipelines into weapons, who survived sanctions and wars, place a call at such an hour to a young African revolutionary? What was said in those 47 minutes that left the Kremlin shaken? This is not a tale of dependency. This is not another deal of bases and weapons. This is the story of sovereignty, of dignity, of a new African voice rising where the old empires expected silence. Stay with us. What follows may change how you see the map of power itself. Subscribe now and walk with us through this turning point. The call was brief in time, yet endless in consequence. And to understand why, we must begin 6 months before that night when history's script was torn apart. 6 months before that fateful call at 3 o'clock in the morning, a tremor rippled through West Africa. One that neither Paris, nor Moscow, nor Washington had anticipated. For the first time in over 60 years, 3 nations moved as one. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger expelled foreign military bases not gradually, not with hesitation, but simultaneously. It was as if 3 locked gates, rusted by decades of dependence, were thrown open in the same breath. The symbolism was unmistakable. For generations, African soil had hosted the boots of foreign soldiers. French bases in Ouagadougou, American operations in Niamey, advisors who claimed to bring stability but left dependency in their wake. Then suddenly, the soil itself spoke. It rejected the weight of foreign garrisons and declared that security would no longer be outsourced. What startled the world even more was what came next. The 3 governments did not replace French troops with Russian troops, nor did they trade one patron for another. They built something unprecedented, a defense alliance crafted entirely by Africans, funded with African resources, directed by African decision-making. It was sovereignty written in bold letters across the Sahel. Observers in Western capitals dismissed it as a passing gesture of defiance. In Moscow, analysts watched with curiosity but little concern. After all, Russia's Africa playbook was well rehearsed. For 2 decades, the Kremlin had waited for African countries to grow weary of Western neglect, then offered its own tools: Russian weapons, Russian advisors, Russian contracts, always tied to Russian control. From Libya to the Central African Republic, the model was predictable. Africans turned from Paris, and Moscow stood ready with an alternative. But Burkina Faso and her allies were not following the script. They were writing their own. The break with precedent grew sharper when Ouagadougou announced a policy that rattled every foreign ministry tracking African affairs. Burkina Faso would begin processing its own gold. For decades, the continent had played the role of supplier, sending raw minerals abroad at pennies and buying back finished products at pounds. A gram of gold sold at $60, refined abroad, then returned at $200. The difference, $140, was siphoned away year after year, generation after generation. Now, that difference would remain on African soil, not in theory, not in speeches, in practice. Gold refineries, once imagined as out of reach, were being built with African hands and African partners. Yet the true shock was not the policy itself, but the partners chosen to bring it to life. Traoré did not look to Moscow for machinery, nor to Beijing for engineers, nor to Washington for advisors. Instead, he reached across the Atlantic, not to governments, but to people. African Americans, whose expertise spanned software, renewable energy, medicine. Men and women whose ancestors had been torn from the continent, now returning not as outsiders, but as family with knowledge and resources to share. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a software engineer, designed telecommunication systems for Burkina Faso that rivaled Russian security networks. Dr. Kwesa Williams, a renewable energy specialist, crafted solutions that surpassed even China's vast projects in affordability and sustainability. Dr. Michael Thompson, a cardiovascular surgeon, launched medical training that drew students from across Africa, students who might otherwise have gone to Moscow. For Russian intelligence, these developments did not fit the established equations. They expected dependency. They found independence. They expected foreign bases replaced with Russian bases. Instead, they saw no bases at all. They expected a young leader clinging to external patrons. Instead, they saw a president forging bonds of blood and history with a diaspora too deeply rooted to be manipulated. The Kremlin began watching more closely. Reports landed on Putin's desk daily. The tone shifted from casual analysis to urgent briefing. By the third month, a single sentence appeared in bold in a classified memo. If the African-American alliance succeeds, Russia will lose Africa without a single shot being fired. That sentence burned its way through the corridors of Moscow. It was the spark that woke Vladimir Putin before dawn, that compelled him to speak in flawless French, a language he rarely used, and to dial a young revolutionary in Ouagadougou. But the true reason for his alarm was not written in policy documents or economic statistics. It was something deeper, more unsettling to centuries of global strategy. Because what truly alarmed Moscow was not the gold, it was the people we chose to work with. By the time Vladimir Putin picked up the phone in Moscow and spoke those first words in French, he was not simply calling to make contact. He was calling because the ground beneath his Africa strategy was cracking. For 3 months, Russian intelligence had painted a picture of a landlocked nation rewriting the rules of power. And that picture carried a caption the Kremlin had never expected to read: "Africa does not need us." The call itself lasted 47 minutes, but the moment that defined it came less than 10 minutes in. Putin began with the confidence of a man who had stared down NATO, challenged American dominance, and reasserted Russia as a global player. His tone was firm, almost paternal. He offered what he had offered dozens of African leaders before: protection from Western interference in exchange for alignment with Russian interests. It was a formula tested in Syria, in Libya, in the Central African Republic. Then came the reply that split the air like a lightning strike. "Mr. Putin," Ibrahim Traoré said with measured respect, "Russia has been in Africa for 20 years, and you are still competing with France and America. We have been truly independent for 18 months, and we are already achieving results your experts said were impossible. Perhaps you should be asking what Russia can learn from Africa." The silence that followed lasted 37 seconds. Traoré counted every heartbeat. On the other end of the line, the Kremlin's master strategist had no words. For the first time in the conversation, the balance of power shifted. When Putin spoke again, the bravado was gone. His voice carried a weight that was neither condescension nor command, but curiosity. He asked a question No African leader had ever heard from a world power. President Traoré, what exactly are you building in Africa? That question opened the floodgates. Traoré explained the philosophy that underpinned the alliance with African Americans. Not dependency, disguised as partnership, but a return of family. Not aid that chained, but cooperation that healed. Telecommunication networks safer than Chinese systems. Renewable energy cleaner than American solutions. Medical training that blended cutting-edge science with African traditions. Each example chipped away at Moscow's long-held assumptions. For decades, Russian policymakers had assumed African progress depended on foreign expertise. But here was a leader describing results that surpassed Russian capabilities, achieved not with Kremlin contracts, but with diaspora collaboration. The more Traoré spoke, the more the call became less of an offer from Moscow and more of a lesson delivered to it. What Russia framed as a counterweight to Western dominance was suddenly revealed as another form of dependence. What Africa was demonstrating was something beyond counterweights. It was autonomy. Then came another moment of revelation. Putin admitted, not to his advisors, not in a public speech, but in a private call at 3 o'clock in the morning, that Russia's Africa strategy had been built on a false premise. The premise that Africa would always need external support. But what you are describing, Putin said slowly, suggests Africa does not need to depend on anyone if Africans work together effectively. That changes the entire global balance of power. Those words, spoken in a tone tinged with vulnerability, marked a rupture in the logic of geopolitics. The man who rebuilt Russia from post-Soviet collapse was acknowledging that the very foundation of global influence, the belief that weaker nations must lean on stronger ones, might not apply to Africa anymore. For Traoré, the implications were clear. If Moscow could be unsettled by 18 months of authentic independence, what would happen when 30 African nations followed the same path? What would happen when the African diaspora, with its trillions in economic power, reconnected with the continent on its own terms? The Kremlin, shaken, did not stop at words. Within days, Putin convened his top Africa advisors in an emergency session. Reports suggest he told them Russia could no longer treat Africa as a region that needed guidance. To do so, he warned, would leave Russia irrelevant. 2 weeks later, Russia unveiled a major policy shift. Fewer bases, fewer extraction deals, more offers of technology partnerships and educational exchanges. For the first time in years, Moscow moved not to impose, but to adapt. But the deeper impact was not in Moscow's corridors of power. It was in the symbolism of that 37-second silence. A silence in which the Kremlin realized it was no longer the teacher, but the student. And then Putin asked the question no African leader had ever been asked before. The morning after the call, life in Ouagadougou looked deceptively ordinary. Markets opened. Children walked to school. Buses rumbled along dusty roads. Yet beneath that surface, the trajectory of a nation, and perhaps a continent, had shifted. For Burkina Faso, the decision to cut ties with foreign military dependence, to refine its own gold, and to forge bonds with a diaspora was more than policy. It was the laying of foundations for a legacy. Economically, the numbers told a story of transformation. For decades, raw gold had left the country in tons, refined abroad, and returned in glittering forms that cost 3 times more. The difference, $140 per gram, vanished into foreign pockets. With domestic refining, that value stayed in Burkina Faso. It was invested into schools, into clinics, into roads that reached villages long forgotten. Each coin, minted locally, was more than currency. It was proof that sovereignty could be measured in infrastructure, not just in speeches. Socially, the impact was no less profound. Dr. Michael Thompson's medical programs began training young Burkinabe in techniques that rivaled Moscow's universities. Students who once dreamed of scholarships in Paris or Beijing found themselves at home, studying in classrooms infused with both innovation and African healing traditions. Instead of brain drain, there was brain return. Diaspora expertise was not a visiting lecture. It was a seed planted in fertile soil. Energy, too, began to change the rhythm of daily life, with renewable projects designed by Dr. Kwesa Williams. Villages once plunged into darkness after sunset now glowed with solar-powered lamps. Children studied longer. Shops stayed open later. Communities felt safer. Independence was no longer an abstraction. It was light on a street corner, power in a schoolroom. Politically, Ibrahim Traoré's position solidified. Critics who dismissed him as a soldier-turned-politician without a long-term vision now faced evidence of results. Opposition figures found it harder to argue against tangible improvements. Internationally, leaders who once saw him as a fleeting revolutionary began to calculate that he might be shaping something enduring. Something historians would one day call the Ibrahim Traoré Legacy. But every step forward carried risks. Western powers, unsettled by the expulsion of their bases, whispered of instability. Russian strategists debated how far they could adjust without losing face. Even within Africa, neighboring governments watched cautiously, wondering if the model could spread or if it would trigger new rivalries. The social fabric, too, faced tests. Sovereignty built on gold could create temptation, corruption, profiteering, elite capture. Diaspora partnerships could inspire pride, but also jealousy from those excluded. Security without foreign bases demanded vigilance against insurgencies eager to exploit any gap. Still, the symbolism outweighed the skepticism. In village meetings and city rallies alike, Burkinabe spoke of a new dignity. They compared Traoré's stance to a farmer choosing to plant his own seeds instead of buying imported grain. They described the gold refinery not as a machine, but as a millstone grinding out a future in African hands. And beyond Burkina Faso, the echoes traveled. In Bamako, leaders in Mali pointed to Ouagadougou's progress as evidence that expelling foreign troops was not reckless, but visionary. In Niamey, Niger's officials cited the gold policy when negotiating new resource contracts. Across West Africa, young activists quoted Traoré's words to Putin. Perhaps you should be asking what Russia can learn from Africa. The consequences reached deeper than policies or projects. They reshaped identity. For the first time in living memory, many Burkinabe no longer described their nation in terms of poverty or dependency. They described it in terms of what it could teach others. That shift in self-perception was perhaps the most revolutionary of all. Yet the road ahead was steep. Building institutions strong enough to guard sovereignty was harder than expelling bases. Sustaining partnerships without breeding dependency required discipline. Maintaining public trust in the face of inevitable setbacks demanded transparency. As the weeks passed, the question spread from dusty markets to diplomatic circles. Was this truly the dawn of a new African model, or merely a flicker of rebellion? Is this the foundation of a new African model, or just a fleeting moment in history? When the Kremlin shifted its stance after that midnight call, the world took notice. For 2 decades, Russia's approach to Africa had followed a familiar pattern. Military support, security advisors, resource concessions. But within weeks of Traoré's conversation, Moscow announced something unprecedented: a recalibration. No longer would Russian bases and extraction deals define its outreach. Instead, Putin's administration began to propose technology partnerships, educational exchanges, and agreements that emphasized African decision-making. It was a remarkable admission. The Kremlin, famed for projecting strength, was now signaling that its traditional model was insufficient. Analysts in Washington, Paris, and Beijing scrambled to interpret the meaning. Was Russia yielding ground or adapting to survive in a new era? China, with its Belt and Road projects sprawling across the continent, reacted with unease. For years, Beijing's massive investments in railways, ports, and mines had seemed unassailable. Yet, reports suggested Chinese officials had begun studying the Burkina Faso experiment. How had modest diaspora partnerships outperformed billion-dollar projects? Why were African leaders increasingly praising authenticity over scale? The question unsettled Beijing's Africa planners. In Europe, policymakers faced a different dilemma. Historical ties once gave France and the European Union leverage. Cultural institutions, language, and aid had been their instruments. But these ties looked fragile beside the bonds of heritage linking Africans and African Americans. French media lamented that Paris was losing its role as Africa's cultural compass. European diplomats whispered that their old maps no longer matched the new terrain. In Washington, the reaction was both cautious and conflicted. On one hand, American policymakers saw opportunity. If African American expertise and investment could generate influence more enduring than military presence, then Washington had a new tool in its global strategy. On the other hand, this influence did not flow through the state, but through people, doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, whose loyalties were not to the Pentagon, but to shared ancestry. That duality both intrigued and unsettled American planners. For international organizations, too, the shift was visible. The African Union framed the Sahel Alliance as a model for continental integration. ECOWAS, once criticized as toothless, debated whether to incorporate the Burkina Faso approach into its long-term plans. Even the United Nations issued cautious praise, highlighting the gold policy as an example of resource sovereignty aligned with sustainable development goals. Yet the most striking reaction came from global strategists. Commentators from London to New Delhi recognized that what was unfolding was not merely regional, it was civilizational. The sight of a young leader articulating a vision rooted not in dependency, but in dignity, sent tremors through think tanks that had long assumed Africa would always need external patrons. This, observers concluded, was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about the possibility of an Africa charting its own course towards 2050, with a vision that blended heritage, innovation, and sovereignty. Analysts began calling it the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a phrase that captured both the audacity and the inevitability of Africa's rising role. If Russia could change overnight, what might America and China do next? When Vladimir Putin asked at the end of the call, "What are you going to do next?" he was not simply curious, he was anxious. For the Kremlin, the unknown path of Burkina Faso and its allies was more threatening than any army. For the people of the Sahel, it was a question of destiny. The answer, as Traoré explained, was not about replacing one empire with another. It was about proving that authentic cooperation could outlast strategic dominance. The immediate plan was bold. Within 2 years, an alliance of 30 African nations would be linked through networks of diaspora expertise. Not pledges written in communiques, but projects grounded in energy, education, and healthcare. Universities were already being planned, institutions that would not only attract African students, but global talent. Unlike traditional academies that imported Western curricula, these universities would blend cutting-edge innovation with African philosophy and cultural identity. They would become beacons, proving that knowledge does not flow in one direction, but can radiate from the continent itself. Economic vision was equally ambitious. Instead of exporting raw resources, African companies would create finished products that competed in global markets. But they would not imitate Western models. They would design uniquely African solutions to universal problems. Renewable energy adapted to harsh climates, medical systems, integrating ancestral wisdom, digital networks rooted in community values. Politically, the road ahead required balance. Without foreign bases, security would depend on regional coordination and trust. The new Sahel alliance would need to prevent power vacuums while proving that sovereignty could coexist with stability. Transparency in managing gold and resource revenues would be vital. Without it, the promise of independence could decay into the old story of elites enriching themselves. Yet for every risk, there was opportunity. The partnership with African Americans was not a charity, nor a symbolic reunion. It was a rediscovery of family. That bond, unbreakable by sanctions or contracts, was the foundation of resilience. Where external powers measured influence in weapons and trade deals, Africa measured it in belonging. The road ahead was not without enemies. Terror groups would test the resolve of the alliance. Foreign powers, threatened by diminishing control, would attempt to divide. Economic challenges would strain unity. But in the eyes of millions, the journey had already begun. For the first time in generations, Africa was not asking what it could gain from the world. It was asking what the world could learn from Africa. The vision was clear. A continent that would no longer be defined by poverty or aid, but by pride, by innovation, by unity. The Ibrahim Traoré experiment was no longer a question mark. It was a statement. And the world was watching to see how far it would go. But the true test is not in promises. It is in the next decade of choices. The call at 3 o'clock in the morning was not just a conversation between two men. It was a signal to the world that the age of dependency may be closing, and a new chapter of sovereignty may be opening. When Vladimir Putin admitted that power might come not from controlling others, but from empowering one's own people, it was more than diplomacy. It was an echo of history, the sound of centuries of assumptions cracking. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was never about Russia versus the West. It was about Africa versus its own past of imposed limitations. The choice to refine gold at home, to build universities that fuse tradition with innovation, to light villages with renewable energy. These were not policies. They were declarations. They were the building blocks of something larger. Something that will one day be remembered as the Ibrahim Traoré Legacy. But legacies are not built overnight. They are tested in storms, corruption, division, pressure from powers that profit from Africa's weakness. The question is not whether Burkina Faso can stand alone for 18 months. The question is whether the continent can stand united for decades. Whether a vision that begins in Ouagadougou can ripple outward to Lagos, to Kinshasa, to Addis Ababa, until the continent speaks with one voice. And that is why observers have begun to call this not merely a policy shift, but the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. A vision where scattered peoples reconnect, where sovereignty is not an aspiration, but a daily practice, where Africa defines its future without waiting for permission. So we return to the question Putin asked, the one that lingers still. What are you going to do next? The answer is not in Moscow, nor in Washington, nor in Beijing. It is in the hands of Africans and their diaspora. It is in the choices made in boardrooms and classrooms, in refineries and clinics, in villages and cities. It is in the courage to believe that dignity, once claimed, cannot be surrendered. If you believe in this journey, share this story, leave your voice in the comments, and subscribe to walk with us. The legacy is being written, and the next chapter begins now.